1 and part 2. So, if you haven't read the Journal of Information Architecture, there's actually a very good article in it in this volume called A Brief History of Information Architecture. So you'll want to take a look at that, journalofia.org. And Andrea and Luca do a good job of going through some of the history. So a good way to set the stage for what we're going to talk about today. So they have a nice picture in the article that starts back in the 1960s. They talk about things that happened in IBM Labs and Xerox Labs and Richard Saul Wurman, sort of from an information design perspective. But there's this synthesis that happens with Rosenfeld and Morville in the late 1990s, right? So that's sort of the first stage up to 1990 as some of the history. We're not going to focus on that one too much. But then they break the history up into a second stage, from 1990 to 2000 and beyond. So we're going to structure our panel around this a little bit, right? So something that they call classic information architecture. So that's good. So we'll share some of our perspectives as we were back in those days. I don't know if we thought that we were doing classic information architecture at the time, but I guess that's better than other things that they could be calling it today. And then sharing stories about how we've been practicing it over the last 12 years, getting us into today. Okay, so that's just a little structuring of how we're going to do the panel. So yeah, as Dan mentioned, we started with, we wanted to get some information architects, people that were practicing it in Ann Arbor in 2000. So we have a couple people that worked with me at Argus Associates. We also have Josie, who is here at Borders. So it's not just Argus folks, but again, trying to give an Ann Arbor feel to it, because in 2000 Ann Arbor was a hub of this activity. And also trying to select folks that have taken some interesting paths, right? And so we'll let them describe some of the paths that they've taken, with the word interesting, maybe not all good or maybe not all bad. And of course, they had to be willing to think about, think back 12 years, what were things like back then, and how are they the same and how are they different, right? Because I think definitely some things are the same, some things maybe are more universal, maybe only change, every millennial or something, and other things are definitely radically different over the past 12 years. So that's sort of how we'll structure the panel. So we'll leave this up, and we'll use this slide as a way for everybody to introduce themselves. So I'm at the top. I actually have the least interesting path of all. After I stopped working for Argus, I joined IBM, and I've been there ever since. So that one actually isn't very interesting. For the most part, I've been called an information architect at IBM, and we can get into the pros and cons of that. But even as things have changed within the company, I've managed to keep that title, although sometimes people call me a user experience lead. It depends on what I'm working on. Dennis, would you like to introduce yourself to the crowd and tell us a little bit about your journey?
Sure. Good morning. My name is Dennis Schleicher. Right now, my job title is executive producer, and I'm out at Sears in Chicago. I've taken a very interesting path, but I don't think that it's really changed what I do. I would say I've been doing the same thing even before Argus and during Argus and after. My background's perhaps a little bit unique. I don't come out of the LIS background. Mine is business and industrial anthropology. So in terms of user-centered design, I'm very user with another user and another user, and trying to figure out solutions and opportunity spaces there. But I've worked a number of different industries, nonprofit, educational, fascinating area in instructional design. For large companies and small companies, an INI and an Audi. I've loved it all and pretty much considered information architecture to be the bedrock foundation throughout all those different industries and all the different types of problems and different types of companies that are out there.
Okay. Josie?
I'm Josie Scott. I'm here because, yes, I worked at Borders.com, and that was a fun and interesting and an important moment in the history of Ann Arbor information architecture. Began actually with a long history with the state, transitioned into the digital age there, and then began my user experience and information architecture career. Worked at Ford, worked at CompuWare, worked a number of different roles, but all fundamentally relating to the users. It does turn out that sort of my interest and passion is in the piece of the pie where we're looking at users and understanding what they do and what they need, what their goals are, et cetera. So all of the roles related to that, but that does not mean I do not love my card sorts and my site maps and all of that. I love to sort of take all of that and translate it into great design, and I have the privilege of having learned from Argus and all of the greats in Ann Arbor, and the great thing is that everybody here today has that same opportunity. So,
Sean?
Hi, and my name's Sean Steeman. I have a law degree. I came from a legal background. I found that practicing law, I could kind of recast legal problems into information problems and solve them. And so then I decided to get a master's at SI. I was one of the first graduating classes after SI became SI instead of the School of Library Science. So I kind of thought I would become a law librarian. But then I went into consulting, and I've stayed in consulting and worked in banking and finance, and now I'm at Proficient in Livonia.
Okay, good. Thanks. So after that, with those brief introductions, we're going to go into a series of rounds where each person will sort of tell some stories about either what's the same or what's different. We'll go through and let everybody on the panel get a chance to sort of raise some issues and some things to talk about, and then we're going to open it up to you guys, right? So we definitely don't want to just be up here talking all the time. We want to take questions from you, let you guys have comments, let somebody like Dave stand up and share his similar story of his experiences over the last 12 years. So we want this to be as interactive as possible. Oh, there we go. Right, so we'll do it, try to keep it short. So I put keep it short in caps, not for you, but for us, okay? So keep it short so that we can iterate. We were pretty open on it. You know, they could talk about big things like how the web is changing, how technology is changing, how culture is changing. They could be very specific on how clients, you know, my clients are not stupid anymore, or things like that, right? Or just very, very concrete things like Josie mentioned already, some of the deliverables that we do. So it's going to be a hit or miss, you know, on purpose in different areas. Again, discussions from you. We're prepared to do actually 2 rounds. We could even do 3, 4, and 5 rounds if we want to. But again, if you have lots of questions and we only make it through 1 round, then that's fine. Then we're going to end a little bit, just sort of lead into the future part of let all of our panelists do a little bit of prognosticating, and then Carl and Peter will sort of pick up from that in the next session. Okay. So I get to go first. So one thing, as I look back, this was a diagram. I don't remember if this actually ever got published in the Polar Bear book, but we used it in a lot of Argus deliverables, this thing called the Global Content Repository that we drew up, I think, for the first time with Ernst & Young. But the idea being that we started with a diagram of all their content management systems, and there were like 20 of them, right? Their Career Center had their own, and each office of Ernst & Young had their own, and we slowly started combining them and saying, well, if we combine these collections of content, then, you know, we can now slice and dice the information in more ways. So eventually we just said, well, hey, why can't we just, as a concept at least, let's just show this as a large global content repository, right? I think Ernst & Young liked it. The one part I remember they didn't like is we actually had some sort of extra loose stuff on the side for the different firms so that they could do their own thing. And they said, no, that's no good. We don't want to give them any power to do their own thing, right? But this general diagram has served me well over the years at IBM in different contexts. So I started with, again, as I would work with different business units, let's draw out all of your content. Oh, if you want this type of experience, you're going to have to combine these things, and not necessarily into the same database, but in a virtual way. So things like the IBM part of software group has this as a model for their products, right? And so we can do certain things on the IBM website because they have their content in it. Now, we can't do other things across IBM because the rest of IBM doesn't. But this general concept of the global content repository, it comes in handy for all sorts of discussions around why can't we do this, why can't we do this, how do we get, you know, what's the roadmap to get to something like this, because that is the experience that we want to do. So it's an old diagram, but I use it over and over again. So Dennis, do you want to go ahead and?
Let's see. Is it? Is this better? See, for me, I put a same and a different right here. For me, user experience people will still learn best from their experience doing it. I really, really like doing card sorts. I think that it's absolutely fascinating. But and I've maybe done 200 different ones so far. I did them even before coming to Argus as a way to understand how people structure their thought and how they engage in organizing things. But there's a lot of materials out there on how to do card sorts, and there's wonderful automated card sort software out there. But I've always found that the experience of doing it and finding out, oh, let's see, I tried this one too large, I tried this one too small, too many people, too few people. The experience of doing it is more important than just understanding the theoretical underlying, like why card sort. Oh, okay, you're trying to find out about, what their cultural ideas are. You're trying to find out about what the answers to the test are with just the questions. It's a fascinating exploration. But one of the things that I found both, 10 years ago and within the last year is the best information architects out there or experienced designers are the people who have actually engaged in trying to do it. So it's not something that you can only read about. It's that strange mix between a science and an art. And I think that it still holds true today. So if you're reading about something, and you have to go out and try it. So if you're in school and grad school, you have to try it. Do it on your family. Do it on your dorm mates. Do card sorts. I mean, if it's something that you're interested in, do many of them on all different kinds of things. That is something that I found to be the absolute same 10 years ago and still today. Something that I think is very different is that one of the groups that 10 years ago we didn't have maybe so much as front-end developers and developers that were doing information architecture. I have found over the last 5 years and accelerating probably in the last 3 years that developers are much more closer to doing what might be considered real IA or real user experience design than ever before. I don't want to posit it as they're eating the lunch of people that are coming out of a more traditional background, but they are absolutely changing the field, how fast things get developed, how fast things can be prototyped, and I think that it's a radical difference from 10 years ago in terms of the speed of development and the engagement of, on my teams now, teams are made up of not just designers and visual designers and copywriters, but also with developers. They're an integral part of the teams now.
Good.
So I'm going to have to look a little bit over my shoulder just to know where I'm at. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the elephant in the room, and that is what's different, and give you a little history of Borders.com. So for the 70s to the 90s, really Borders was innovation. They took books and computerized their inventory and their handling, and were able to predict sales, things like that. That was a huge piece that the Borders brothers brought along. So, excuse me, as they began to expand, they attracted Kmart, and Kmart bought them. And I understand that Kmart was a great silent partner who let the Borders people just try things, and they grew and they grew. And I came along in the 2000s, a couple of years after the .com had been launched. And as you can see, the first one didn't even have e-commerce, but they needed to have a presence. And then they created the e-commerce.com, if you want to go ahead. And here it is. And as you can see, I think this reflects the Borders brand really, really well. It says smart, knowledgeable. Come on, sit down and take a look around for a while and go ahead and see what you want to learn. Now, granted, we don't exactly use the web that way now. And so we did a great job, and this was all done with the input. I had very little to do with the actual design of this, and I'm going to say that right now. The greats came in and consulted with Borders, Argus Associates, a few other folks, and they all helped design it. They created their own content management system. They had their own processes, and they had some of the best customer service of any of the websites that were out there. They were innovative even still as they launched. And I helped spin the plates, created a few taxonomies, did a few card sorts, helped create Stores.com, which we anticipated would be this sort of point of integration. So this was Amazon at the time. I think we were competing fairly well. This was the year of the lots and lots and lots of tabs. They were just starting to get that under control. But also, we recognized that there were issues as far as recommendation engines and better search than we were currently offering, et cetera. So we knew that it was time to do something else, to take the next step. And we put together some ideas and presented them. But quite honestly, the question was, spend a lot of money on the website. The website was earning less than a single store every year. Or transition it to somebody who knew what they were doing and just not worry about that and just concentrate on your stores. And that was the decision. So I will not say that failure to support the .com is the reason that Borders is not here today, but it is an element of the issue. It's that sort of failure to integrate. So rather than say what Borders didn't do, I'd like to tell you what a retail store should be doing, which is to say that the store and the .com are complements of each other, and after a while, I think stores are just going to be showrooms, and you're just going to be paying for it with whatever it is you have anyway. And maybe you'll have it shipped to your home because that's a whole lot more convenient. And getting to that point is going to be critical for those who want to survive. So because Borders made the choices it did, that's store one right around the corner. So.
I've noticed over the last 10 years, one of the big changes, but one of the things that stayed the same is that 10 years ago when I went out with Argus on an engagement, we talked about identifying the audience and putting the audience in touch with information that would help them. And we talked a lot with clients about the fact that you had to identify that audience. Well, over the entire 10 years, I've seen the rise of personas, spent a lot of time developing personas and read books on persona development. And I still go into meetings, recently where people will kind of say, well, I understand the client and they all do this or they all do that. And there isn't even any audience segmentation. And you get these I statements about, well, I'm not quite sure that I like what's in the footer. And you spent weeks coming up with the 3 personas and having links in the footers that serve those audiences in certain contexts. And you still get some executive who didn't go through that process saying, you really need to redo that. And so on one hand, I've seen this great change, on the academic side. Maybe that's that academically we've become aware of these issues. But one thing I haven't seen in the trenches is business oftentimes becoming aware of that. And you still see, especially as an IA, project managers understand that they can't code the site, and project managers understand that they can't do the visual design. But a lot of project managers I work with are pretty outspoken about the fact that, well, they could do the IA. They know how to organize the stuff. That's just common sense. And, when it comes up that, well, I went and got a master's degree? What a bullshit master's, just kind of, what a waste of time. And so it is, it stays the same, but it changes. And that idea of things in context, Kat's definition was up there. I remember working, I was the project manager on that, as I recall. Like, she did all the work, but I had to do some scheduling. Kat was all about context. I learned so much from her when I worked from her because she just talked about context all the time, even more so than a lot of the other IAs that I worked with at Argus. And I think she's right. She's become more correct all the time over the last 10 years, that it's about context and realizing that everyone isn't in this kind of generic I'm the user role.
Okay, did you want to read your poem? Or
Oh, well,
do you remember that?
Yeah, so that's the other thing is I've been trying to read more poetry. Maybe that's not good. But, Billy Collins wrote this great poem a few years ago, and he put it in his introduction to poetry, that, he doesn't, I think you can put the word website in here for poem throughout. That, he wants people to go to his poems and water ski across and try and understand it. And that's but you go into a business context, and they don't want their users to surf across their site, or another stanza that I didn't put here, be like a mouse where they're dropped into the poem and find their way out. They want to tie the website to a chair and beat it with a hose and try and figure out what it means. And I think that's kind of a true thing, and it's one of the real problems that business people have, is they feel like they need to almost over-engineer that experience, and by trying to over-engineer it, they end up under-engineering it. Perfection is the enemy of the good kind of thing.
Okay, so we threw a lot at you. We want to hear from you guys. Ask us questions, tell us where we're full of it, provide different perspectives. Yes? You want to repeat the question just in case?
Yeah, how do you get business stakeholders up to speed? And I feel like I'm blowing off your question, but one of the mistakes I've made is trying to get them up to speed, because then you get feedback that you're kind of pedantic and sort of academic, and you're not really understanding the context of where it is, and like that I kind of went to that big university and that was a problem. Where if you just talk about the issue and really try and keep it that, well, there are reasons why we've done what we've done, and keep it within the context of the project or within the context of the requirements gathering. And to answer your question maybe more pointedly is, part of it is to move the problem back into requirements gathering, that a lot of the requirements documents that I see, oftentimes coming in as an IA, I'll have requirements sort of handed to me, and really a large portion of the requirements are design ideas. You'll see a requirement that, we'll have a drop-down menu with 4 choices on it, and it's like, well, no. We'll have something that gives you a way to get to those 4 places. But I recently worked in an insurance company for over a year, and it became a standing joke that whenever anything was handed to me, I went through and took out all the drop-down menus, because they were really into having drop-down menus for yes-no questions. You drop it down and pick yes or no. And I'm like, no, we can do a radio button there, or maybe a checkbox, but a drop-down isn't what I'm ever going to do. And I ended up having to sit with the developers at one point, and we came up with a rule for that company that anything less than 7 choices just wasn't going to be in a drop-down, because I just couldn't communicate the fact that a drop-down, they had been putting everything in a drop-down for years, and I was considered just so outside the box. So, part of that is introducing some humor. Part of that is introducing some attempt at understanding their business. But subject matter experts don't like it when IAs, at least in my opinion, try and say, I really understand your business. It's more, okay, I think I understand this documentation. And I try and keep it within the 4 corners of the project. Otherwise, I bother people. But I bother people in life in general. So.
Yeah, it was very difficult to get him here, but I had to include him because he's a pest. Did you want to answer the same question? Or okay, more questions, more comments.
If you don't answer, ask another question, I'll answer it.
Right. Oh, yes, right here, and then you'll next, and Carl in the corner. Go ahead. Okay, who wants to tackle it?
Let's see. So probably the most telling is my change in job title. So I'm now executive producer for a large-scale game at Sears and Kmart for internal employees, and that's radically different than saying, hey, we're going to help these people find somebody else's name in the database of who works here. I think that we're seeing definitely a large-scale movement from just finding information, which was never the problem in the beginning. Okay, you're not out there searching for information; you're searching out there for answers, right? to questions that you have or problems that you want to solve or to find something that's interesting. It's, you know, it's so dry to say finding information. It's about findability, but finding the answers. And I would say that new techniques that I've come up with to try and use are things like body storming, very interactive with lots of people there. I agree that we don't have enough on understanding the users, and personas was one way that unfortunately I've too found that fails horribly. But having people engage in trying to be the people or be the different actors and interacting together and fighting amongst trying to work through interfaces or mobile devices gets away from understanding the user to understanding what's the impact that you want to have. And I think that methods right now need to more focus on and understanding what impact you want to have, which is requirements, right? It's not about figuring out what the interface is. It's what's the impact that you want to have for the business, and to try and figure out ways to prototype that and design that and communicate that to your business partners, your stakeholders.
I have a thought about that too, and that is it relates to the rise of the title interaction designer. I had a friend of mine say that, and she's an interaction designer, she said, it's such a responsibility because you're not just doing the visual piece. You're not worried about just this little, look and feel here. You're holding all of the strings in your hand. You have to think before, you have to think after, you have to think what every piece of the application, and it's usually application focused when you're working with interaction design. Every piece of that application, what it's going to do and how it's going to act and where it's going to go, et cetera. And it takes a lot to be a great interaction designer. So I think that that's an indication of how we've moved along. That doesn't mean that content still isn't king or queen, but it's still, it has become a part of the path, if you will. How's that?
Okay, Carl, you were next, and then.
Well, I'd get rid of hierarchy. I've had people in business meetings explain to me that hierarchy organization is the only way to organize information on the web. And, they're thinking of how they've organized a browsable, navigation system, and it's hierarchical. So whenever you start talking about, at least in the context I've been, where I keep trying to emphasize search and findability a little more, it's always very much that everything's got to be hierarchical. You can't have a multifaceted plan where you tag things for several different audiences or several different purposes. And it ties into what we were just talking about, that part of, maybe what we should surface more is that there really is a difference between academia, where people are thinking more in terms of creating websites that generate community, and the business sites that I tend to work on day to day, where there's still a sort of, they want to sell a product, and they know that they need to pay lip service to community, but they still really want to sell a product. And so, they're trying to measure. Last night, I think Dennis was talking about, I've run into where they'll have metrics because, a bunch of MBAs, and you want to break it down to numbers that you can understand. And so, one metric is you want more time on site so that people are engaging with your site. And another metric is you want people to actually click on the get a quote or purchase the product. And it's hard to explain to people that those metrics are at odds with one another. If you want them to really spend time on site, they're not going to be clicking on the get a quote. And I did some work for an auto insurance company, and that was a constant tension. More time on site, but they want people to come and click on get the quote. And so as an IA, you were put in a position where it was unwinnable, and if you started trying to teach, well, then you were seen as pushing back, not teaching. So it's an interesting. It's what makes work fun, though, and interesting. Actually, is that it's not so cut and dry.
I'll take. Carl, I would say that those four elements are not only the same today, even more critical. And I would say, especially around organization and structure, is sorely lacking in most design, most work out there. and most approaches that people take. I would say that going back to the original Polar Bear book and those 4 concepts needs to be taken much more seriously than ever before. So I would say just dig in deeper to those.
Yeah, and for me, the change is the size of the unit, right? It's not pages, but it's sentences, it's smaller chunks of content, right? So the content's still important. You still got to organize in those ways, but you now have to organize smaller pieces that have more characteristics and assemble them in more different ways rather than just being page-based.
Get rid of pages, get rid of hierarchy.
Okay, it's done. See, we can do that because it's World IA Day. We can do those things, right? You can't just do that at a normal conference. So another question, or do you want us to go to another round? We're going to wrap it up at about 10:50, right? So we'll only be about 5 minutes behind schedule. So we'll definitely take some more questions. We can also throw at you some more things to think about the rest of the day. Okay, well, we'll do another quick round. Okay, so for me, when I look back, one of the big changes was going from an outie to an innie, right? So consulting was great. I sort of, at the extreme, right, to make a point, it's all about take the money and run and get the hell out of there before, they actually try to do any really hard work, right? As an employee, I just a totally different approach to things. It's a lot more teaching focused. It's a lot more building relationships. It's that's a really hard problem. It's going to take IBM about 5 years to solve it, if not longer. What can we do in the next 6 months, right? And breaking it down. And then a lot of times I'll often work with a group and they'll go away and they'll come back a year later. And it's like, Keith, we figured out how to solve the problem now. It took them a year to, after I showed them that global content repository, it took them a year to come back and they say, now we're ready, right? So it's really building that. And a lot of times I can look back to certain parts of IBM. I lost every single battle. Every time they wanted to do something, they did the wrong thing. But in the end, I won the war, right? So that's sort of me looking back over time. Dennis?
Let's see. For myself, the same and the different. Same as talking with users, visiting their spaces and places. I'll give you a very short example. We're talking 10 years ago. Was working on, a lot of us have worked in similar spaces and places, so worked at JWT on Ford work, and we're building the My Ford owner site. And we're here like, okay, how do owners organize their lives, their information? What would a site that would be useful for them? And so we're sitting down there, and we were working with a consulting company who was going to go out and do interviews and the group of people. And they said, okay, so we'll convene a focus group. And I said, no focus group. And they said, okay, we'll go out there and we'll visit people's houses. And I said, wrong again. I said, you're going to go into their cars. This is about their vehicles, right? You're going to go and you're going to open their glove box. They're going to open their owner's manual. You're going to see what pages are dog-eared, which are the ones that go in. You're going to take out every single piece of paper that they have shoved in their car for keeping track of their records. And you're going to take photographs of them so that we can see what people are actually doing now. And then we're going to be able to see what kinds of records they keep, what kinds of problems that they have. Wonderful. We had the highest registration rate that you could ever imagine. We were beating Yahoo by 200-300%. Millions of users, and successfully coming back, not just registering, but coming back and using it because we talked with users. We visited their spaces. We visited their places. This is so important back then and still today. Even with remote usability, I think that is the absolute same. What's different is more design studio, more collaboration. As I was saying before, we have more developers that are part of the group and stakeholders. So throughout the design process, we actually have more cross-functional collaboration, not just inside the group who's building the site, but even with stakeholders. And we involve them in exploration, in requirements gathering. So with BI and analysts, we involve them in. This is radically different than how it was 10 years ago, where we would come back to the castle back in Ann Arbor, do our magic, and then take it out again. Yep. Radically different. So those are my same and different stories.
So this is the thing that's the same about Ann Arbor, and I think it has its foundation that goes decades ago. The fact is Ann Arbor is very community focused, and as information architecture came along, that community sort of suffused the whole field, and people were very, very generous with what they knew and what they shared. And I personally learned so much from everyone that was involved in the early information architecture world, and I'm very grateful to them at this moment. The fact is that I think that continues. And that all of you here have the opportunity, like I say, to actually be a part of that community and to grow and to contribute to it as well. I think I might have made a small contribution or two in my time. So the image that I have up here was a conference that was organized by Argus, and it was out in La Jolla, but you get that sense. I met people from all over the world. I had a great time. I learned a ton and immediately brought that back and continued, and I do that to this day. So that hasn't changed, and I don't see it changing in the future. The community sharing is a part of what we do. We are generous people, and everyone should take advantage of it.
Well, and I just had the mundane, when I look back over the last 10 years, one of the big differences I see is 10 years ago, I was designing everything for a browser on a desktop. And, you know, the big issue was whether to go, 640 by 480 or 800 by 600, I think. And 1024 by 768, well, that was just, what, 2 or 3% of the users, so that didn't make sense on its face. And I can remember Anthony Hand, a fellow Argonaut, went to Boston and started doing interfaces for small devices. And at the time, I thought, wow, that's kind of an alternative, little niche thing he's doing. Now Anthony has 10 years experience doing stuff that I've been struggling to do for the last 3, right? That he was just years ahead, which is one of the nice things about Argus, that people were thinking like that. But yeah, now, and especially now with the mobile first kind of movement, I found over the last couple of years, I have to pay attention to what style sheets are and where those breakpoints are, how the media queries are going to be implemented so that you know which style sheet's going, with which display of this same information. And that just never came up until 5 years ago. And it sure changes things on a project management level, which I tend to be a little over on the IA/project manager. It just creates a lot more coordination or different coordination because you can go off and do one interface, but you've still got to coordinate with those other devices that are hopefully trying to use the same information and present it in a way that's appropriate for that other device. And again, it makes it even more interesting. Day to day, it's more frustrating, and as a career, it makes it more interesting.
Okay, so let's pause again. Some more ideas, some more things to talk about. Were we full of baloney? Where can you add to our points?
I don't know. I would say that.
Great.
So
Repeat.
the question was, do I expect all developers to have a user experience background, or
the reverse?
Or the reverse? I would say that I don't know. First, it depends on what they're interested in. One thing that I've noticed over time, over the last 10 years, is also the information architecture profession 10 years ago chose me, right? And because there was no degree that you could go out and get. Nowadays, you can choose to have an information architecture degree. And I think that this also is, what is it, U.S. News and World Report for the last couple of years has it listed, or usability listed, as one of the top 10 careers to get into for the next decade. And that both excites me and scares the shit out of me. Because I think, great, I'm going to have some parent saying, you're going to school to learn usability because it's a good job, and right now people don't have jobs. And they have no love for it, but they want, inherent love for it, but they need to have a job and they need to make some money. Is that good or is that bad? I don't know. But it's definitely a change that I've seen over the last 10 years, which is very different from how I came to, or how I was exposed to it. So I think that is not up to me, but I'm definitely seeing the trend that people are coming with both. Maybe it's bilingualism. I'm not quite sure.
So I'm going to suggest that the answer to that question is no. Not necessarily. Let me put it that way. Nothing wrong with having a developer background, but I can also see the development in general becoming somewhat more Siri-based, if you will. Hey, computer, just do this thing for me, and a natural language sort of relationship with a computer, and now you're programming it. Why not? So if that's true, then what skill is really important? The skill of communication, the skill of empathy and understanding, of getting user requirements and goals out there and making sure they're reflected well, having design. So nothing wrong with being a developer and having development skills, but I will also say that I anticipate that the skill of great design is, well, it's not just a skill, it's also there's some talent in there. That's probably going to be part of a critical piece of the background.
So just a quick show of hands, who in this room is a developer and proud of it? Okay, just so you know, it's not us or them, we're all in this room together. So thank you. Go ahead, Sean, if you want to.
Oh, I think at SI we were required to take Java, so there was there was a recognition of that, and I was at SI when they were pulling in all the new faculties, and the faculty members, were a varied bunch, but there were a bunch of them that were computer science PhDs from MIT, and when talking to them in office hours, the whole idea was that MIT, they were considered real soft guys because they were interested in all that information stuff, and SI really fit them. But I remember Paul Resnick saying that the goal is to understand one or two levels deeper than where you're designing. That if you're designing right at the edge of your understanding, your designs are always going to be more amateurish than if you understand a little deeper. And I think you have to have that developer background just so that your understanding of what's going on is a little deeper than what you're actually dealing with in the day-to-day interaction design that you're trying to actually accomplish.
Derek? Yeah.
Yeah, so one question I thought would be interesting is, for good or bad, what do you think has changed about end users? And what do you think has stayed the same about end users?
So yeah, what has changed about end users? What has stayed the same about end users?
Yeah, end users, I think a larger percentage of end users have a lot more comfort with the web, and so they're very aware of the vocabulary, how websites have historically been produced than they were 10 years ago, just because there's been more years of them using the web, getting used to some of those real standards, or tired of those standards of always having a header on the page and a footer on the page. So it's like anything else, that as the audience becomes more familiar with the standard vocabulary, you can step outside that vocabulary and kind of play with it. Or on the other hand, if you really just want to sell product, you have a vocabulary that's more defined and that you could stay within. So I think of an analogy with, like, a filmmaker can either create the film that really just starts at the beginning, has a middle, and goes to an end, or they can try and be real artsy and play with that narrative structure. And you can do that more when you have an audience that's familiar.
I'll answer that too, and I would say the thing that hasn't changed is basic biology. The cognitive structures of the brain are what they are. Goals, motivations, and behaviors are fundamentally unchanged and probably will remain so. So what's different is we have technology now that we plug into so much more than we did. And I anticipate in the future that technology is just going to live with us constantly. And actually, my family complains that that's true of me now. So the fact is that we are just going to relate a whole lot more to our technology systems. And they're not just going to be on devices and so forth. We already see cars, but how about your refrigerator? That's coming, so.
I would say that it has changed so radically in the last 10 years that most of the user research done 10 years ago is obsolete and dead. I would say that the user also is going to be dead in 5 years. We're not going toward, cyborgs and augmented reality. But agents will now become your co-conspirators and co-pilots. Siri is no longer going to be something that is just a servant to you, but it'll be, you will go and you'll do your job interview with your Siri co-pilot helping you get jobs, and this is going to be radically changing what the user or the concept of the user is. I think that fun also is on the forefront. 10 years ago, we didn't, let alone the emotion of fear. What are people most scared about here, and how can we do that? I don't think anybody tried to design user interfaces for fun, except for in the video game sphere. I would say with gamification and a light approach, but entertainment. I mean, look at all the educational content that is online now for people to do on their own. Education over the last 100 years has mostly been about teaching people how to keep their ass from falling asleep in a hard seat for 8 hours a day, right? To prepare them for a work world in which they'd probably be doing the same, or at least, you know, if they could get better at doing it, then they could go higher up the ladder. I don't think that's the case anymore. So the users, what they're going to be doing is affected both by the, you know, moving into more technology focus, and also for the changing demands of the workplace and our normal environment. So radically different, and I think that that's going to increase probably within 2 to 3 years. Radical increases on fun, on dynamic web pages, on how we make our identities with machines, with computers, with our software. I do not know where this world is going, but I'm very happy to be along for the ride.
So Dennis is tricky because he just gave us his last little part prediction for 12 years in the context of that. So to try to keep us on schedule, we'll just jump ahead. So Dennis, you've already done your prediction. Josie, you got a chance to fill in. Go ahead and fill in.
I definitely hinted at it. Number one, that technology will be pervasive, and I don't just mean computers, but everything will plug into everything else, and you'll simply be working with whatever it is you do for a living, wherever you're at, however you choose to gesture computing, all of that. It's no longer just a case of a mobile device. It's already begun to happen, and we can certainly anticipate that. I don't think that we as human beings will be fundamentally different, because we aren't, because we're built to be who we are. So our systems will have to be more